The cannonball tore through the window. Thomas Montague, Earl of Salisbury, was standing at the upper floor of Les Tourelles, looking out over the city he was about to conquer, planning his next move. The stone sphere punched through the wall, caught him in the face, and ripped away half his skull. He collapsed, blood pooling on the stone floor. His officers rushed forward, but there was nothing to do, nothing to say. The man who'd started the Siege of Orléans was dying from a wound inflicted by a weapon he'd barely considered a threat. 7 days later, he was dead. And the English siege, which should have ended the 100 Years' War, should have given England control of all France, should have crushed the last hope of French resistance, was now in the hands of men who didn't want to be there, didn't believe in the plan, didn't have Salisbury's vision or determination. 6 months later, a 17-year-old peasant girl would break that siege in 9 days. But before we get to Joan of Arc, before we talk about divine visions and miraculous victories and the turning point that changed European history, we need to understand what the Siege of Orléans actually was, because Hollywood got it wrong. The history books simplified it. The legend obscures the reality. This wasn't a simple story of good versus evil. This wasn't a quick battle won by faith alone. This was 7 months of grinding siege warfare, of starvation and disease, of political maneuvering and military calculation, of men dying in ditches for yards of mud, of a city slowly strangling under English control, and of one moment, one impossible moment in May 1429, when everything changed. If you want to understand how medieval siege warfare actually worked, how close France came to complete English domination, and what actually happened during those 9 days when Joan of Arc arrived at Orléans, you need to hear this story, because I'm going to show you the complete history from the first English soldier arriving in October 1428 to the last one retreating in May 1429. Every battle, every fort, every decision that led to the most important military upset of the 15th century. Hit that like button right now if you're ready for the true story of the Siege of Orléans, because what you're about to learn will change everything you thought you knew about Joan of Arc, medieval warfare, and how one city held the fate of an entire kingdom. And if you've never heard the complete story of how a 7-month siege was broken in 9 days, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I'm doing an entire series on medieval warfare that reveals what actually happened versus what the legends tell you. Picture this. It's September 1428. The 100 Years' War has been raging for 91 years. England and France locked in a generational struggle for control of the French crown. And England is winning, decisively, overwhelmingly, in a way that makes French defeat seem inevitable. Henry V had changed everything at Agincourt in 1415. That one battle, where English longbowmen slaughtered French knights by the thousand, had broken French military confidence, had proven that the age of armoured cavalry was ending, that English tactics were superior, that France, for all its size and wealth and population, couldn't stop the English conquest. By 1428, England controlled everything north of the Loire River, Paris, Normandy. Burgundy had allied with England. The Duke of Burgundy, one of the most powerful nobles in France, had chosen the English side. The Dauphin Charles, the French heir to the throne, controlled only the south. And barely that. His government was broke, his army was demoralized, his nobles were divided between those who wanted to keep fighting and those who wanted to negotiate surrender. And then the English decided to take Orléans. This wasn't random. This was strategic brilliance. Orléans sat on the Loire River, the last major city north of the river still loyal to Charles. If Orléans fell, the English could cross the Loire in force, could push south into the French heartland. could march on Bourges, Charles's capital, could end the war. Everyone understood this. French, English, Burgundian. If Orléans fell, France was finished. The Dauphin would have to flee, probably to Scotland or Spain. The English claim to the French throne would become reality. The 100 Years' War would be over. England would have won. So, in early October 1428, Thomas Montague, Earl of Salisbury, marched south from Paris with about 4,000 men. Not a huge army by medieval standards. But Salisbury wasn't planning to storm Orléans. The city walls were too strong, the garrison too large. Instead, he was going to starve them out, build forts around the city, cut off supply lines, wait for hunger and disease to do the work. It was the standard siege playbook, and it had worked for England dozens of times before. Salisbury moved fast. He captured the towns upstream and downstream from Orléans, took Meung-sur-Loire to the west, secured Beaugency, grabbed Jargeau to the east. Each capture tightened the noose, made it harder for supplies to reach Orléans, made the city more isolated, more vulnerable. By October 12th, Salisbury's army arrived outside Orléans itself. The siege had officially begun. But Salisbury had a problem. 4,000 men weren't enough to completely surround a city the size of Orléans. The walls stretched for over a mile. To build a complete ring of fortifications, to truly blockade every entrance, he'd need 3 or 4 times as many troops. So Salisbury made a calculated decision. He'd focus on the south and west, build his main positions there, control the bridge. The bridge was everything. It was the only way across the Loire at Orléans. If you controlled the bridge, you controlled river traffic, controlled supplies, controlled reinforcements. The bridge itself was a masterpiece of medieval engineering. Stone. 19 arches spanning the Loire. And at the southern end, on the far bank from the city, stood Les Tourelles, a fortified gatehouse. Twin towers connected by a heavily defended passage. This was the key to Orléans. Whoever held Les Tourelles controlled the bridge, and whoever controlled the bridge controlled the city's fate. On October 21st, Salisbury attacked Les Tourelles. This wasn't going to be easy. The French garrison defending it was determined, well-armed, ready. The English assault began with an artillery bombardment. Cannons firing stone balls at the walls, trying to create breaches, but medieval fortifications were built to withstand this kind of punishment. The walls held. So the English tried a frontal assault, soldiers charging with ladders, attempting to scale the walls while defenders poured down everything they had. Arrows, crossbow bolts, boiling oil, hot coals, quicklime that burned exposed skin. The assault was brutal. Men screaming, dying, falling from ladders. But the English kept coming, wave after wave, because Salisbury was there, watching, demanding success. The French held them back. The assault stalled. English bodies piled up at the base of the walls. Salisbury realized a frontal attack wasn't going to work, so he switched tactics, mining. The English started digging under the fortifications, planning to collapse the walls from below. The French countered. They dug their own tunnels, met the English miners underground, fought in the darkness, set fire to the English pit props, collapsed their tunnels. It was vicious, close-quarters combat in spaces so tight you could barely swing a sword. On October 23rd, the French abandoned the outer fortifications, fell back to Les Tourelles itself. The English had won the first phase, but the cost had been high. Hundreds dead, and Les Tourelles was still in French hands. Quick favour. If this detailed history of medieval siege warfare is new to you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because I'm creating an entire series on the great sieges that shaped European history, and what's coming up next about Salisbury's death will show you just how brutal and random medieval warfare actually was. Salisbury needed to plan the next assault. On October 24th, he went up to the upper floor of a building the English had captured. He wanted a better view of the city, wanted to see the walls, the defences. The best approach for the next attack. He stood at the window. Officers around him, discussing tactics, debating whether to continue the assault immediately or wait for reinforcements. And then, the French fired their cannon. We don't know if they were aiming at Salisbury specifically. Probably not. Artillery in 1428 wasn't that precise. They were just bombarding the English positions, hoping to hit something valuable. But this particular cannonball, this one stone sphere launched from somewhere inside Orléans, flew through the window where Salisbury stood, caught him directly in the face. The impact was devastating. His skull shattered. One contemporary account says the cannonball took off half his face. Another says it destroyed his eye and the side of his cheek. Salisbury didn't die immediately. He lingered, in agony, for a week. Think about that. A week of consciousness with half your face destroyed. In an era with no real painkillers, no antibiotics, no surgical techniques that could help. Just suffering. Waiting for infection or blood loss or shock to finish what the cannonball started. On November 3rd, 1428, Thomas Montague, Earl of Salisbury, died, and command of the English siege passed to William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk. This was a disaster for the English, not because Suffolk was incompetent. He was a capable enough soldier, but he didn't believe in this siege. He'd argued against it from the beginning, thought Salisbury's plan was too ambitious, too risky. Suffolk wanted to consolidate English gains, not push for more. And now he was in charge of an operation he'd never supported. Suffolk did almost nothing for the next month, just maintained the siege, didn't push for assaults, didn't try to take Les Tourelles, didn't expand the ring of fortifications, just sat there, waiting. The English army settled into winter quarters. This infuriated the field commanders. John Talbot, Lord Shrewsbury, arrived in early December with reinforcements. Talbot was everything Suffolk wasn't. Aggressive, determined, ready to fight. He and Thomas Scales, another English commander, basically shamed Suffolk into resuming active operations. In December 1428, the English began building their network of bastilles. Fortified positions, not full castles, more like reinforced camps, earthwork walls, wooden palisades, ditches. Each bastille held a garrison of 100 to 300 men. Each was positioned to control a specific route, into or out of Orléans, to intercept supplies, to prevent reinforcements. The English built these methodically, starting with the bridge complex on the south bank. They fortified Les Tourelles, built up the defences around Les Augustins, a monastery they'd captured, created connecting trenches and walls. This bridge complex became the centre of English operations, the anchor point, everything else connected to it. Then they spread out, built the Bastille of Saint-Privé to the west of the bridge, guarded the approach from that direction, built the Bastille of Saint-Laurent on the north bank. This became the main English camp, where most of the army stayed, where supplies were stockpiled, where commanders held their councils. Then, the Bastille at Saint-Pouer, and Paris, and Saint-Ladre, each positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, each able to support the others if attacked. By February 1429, the English had approximately 7 major bastilles surrounding Orléans, connected by trenches, patrols, and communication lines. It was an impressive piece of military engineering, professional, well-designed, exactly the kind of siege works that had won England so many victories before. But there was a problem, a gap. The northeast side of Orléans remained open, not completely. The English had patrols, could harass supply convoys, but they didn't have enough men to build fortifications there too. And this gap meant Orléans wasn't fully blockaded. Supplies could still get through if you were willing to risk the dangerous route, if you could afford enough armed escort to fight off English patrols. The French garrison inside Orléans wasn't sitting idle while the English built their forts. They launched sorties, raids out of the city designed to harass the English, to kill workers, to disrupt construction. These raids became almost daily occurrences. Small groups of French men-at-arms charging out of the gates, attacking English positions, killing a few soldiers, burning supplies, then retreating back inside before English reinforcements could arrive. The French also destroyed everything in the suburbs, every building, every church, every structure that could provide shelter for English troops during the winter. They burned it all, created a wasteland around the city. This made the English siege more difficult, more uncomfortable. Soldiers had to sleep in tents or poorly constructed shelters, exposed to the elements, to the cold, to disease. Inside the city, the French garrison was commanded by Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orléans. He was called that because he was the illegitimate son of Louis, Duke of Orléans. But don't let the title fool you. Dunois was one of the best military commanders France had. Smart, experienced, determined to hold the city no matter what. Dunois had about 2,000 professional soldiers, men-at-arms, knights, experienced warriors, plus another 2,000 militia, citizens of Orléans who'd armed themselves, who were ready to defend their homes, and 30,000 civilians, men, women and children who would suffer most if the siege turned into starvation. Dunois knew his job. Keep morale up, ration food carefully, launch enough sorties to keep the English off balance, wait for relief. Because relief had to be coming. Charles, the Dauphin, couldn't let Orléans fall. The political and military consequences would be catastrophic. So Dunois waited and prepared and fought small battles every day, trying to buy time. By January 1429, the situation inside Orléans was deteriorating. Not desperate yet, but heading that direction. Food supplies were running low. The blockade, incomplete as it was working. Convoys trying to reach the city through that northeastern gap were being intercepted more frequently. English patrols were getting better at predicting the routes, at positioning ambushes. The people of Orléans were starting to go hungry. Not starving, not yet. But rationing, worrying, wondering how much longer they could hold out. And then the English won another victory, one that made the French position even worse, the Battle of the Herrings. This battle has one of the best names in military history, and it happened because of Lent, February 1429, the Christian season of fasting, when believers were supposed to abstain from meat. The English army besieging Orléans needed food, needed supplies that conformed to religious law. So a massive convoy left Paris, 300 wagons, loaded with supplies for the English troops, and the main cargo, herrings, barrels and barrels of salted herring, fish you could eat during Lent. The convoy was commanded by Sir John Fastolf. Yes, that Fastolf, the man who supposedly inspired Shakespeare's Falstaff character. Though the real Fastolf was nothing like the comic drunk in the plays. The real Fastolf was a tough, experienced, highly competent military commander. The French learned about this convoy, saw an opportunity. If they could intercept it, destroy it, capture those supplies, they'd hurt the English siege effort, might even force the English to withdraw for lack of food. So the French assembled a force, about 4,000 men, led by the Count of Clermont and Sir John Stuart of Darnley. Stuart was Scottish. Scotland had allied with France, had sent troops to help fight the English. These Scottish soldiers were tough, experienced, ready to fight. On February 12th, near the town of Rouvray, the French caught up with Fastolf's convoy. Fastolf saw them coming. He had only about 1,500 men, 500 English longbowmen and 1,000 Parisian militiamen, probably crossbowmen. He was outnumbered nearly 3-1. But Fastolf was smart. He didn't panic. He ordered his wagons into a defensive circle, a laager, like wagon trains in the American West would do 400 years later. Created a fortified position on the spot. The English archers set up inside the circle, pounded their stakes into the ground, those wooden stakes that protected longbowmen from cavalry charges, left 2 narrow gaps in the wagon circle, fortified those with more stakes, and waited. The French had artillery, small cannons. They started bombarding the wagon fort, and it was working. The cannonballs were smashing wagons, killing men, creating chaos. The English were taking casualties. If the French had just kept up the bombardment, they probably would have won. But the Scottish contingent under Stuart got impatient, decided they wanted to attack, now, immediately, not wait for artillery to do the work. Stuart's Scots dismounted, charged on foot. The French men-at-arms joined them, some on foot, some still mounted. This was exactly what English longbowmen wanted. A target-rich environment. Enemies charging across open ground directly at prepared positions. The arrows flew. Thousands of them. English longbowmen could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Each arrow could punch through armor at close range. The Scots and French charged into a storm of shafts. Men fell by the dozens, by the hundreds. The charge stalled, broke. The survivors retreated. And then Fastolf counterattacked. He mounted his archers on horses, had them carry lances, charged out of the wagon circle while the French were disorganized, routed them completely, killed about 500, mainly Scots. Stuart of Darnley died in the battle. So did one of his sons. French casualties included around 120 knights and 600 men-at-arms. The English lost maybe 100 men total. It was a disaster for France, and it meant Fastolf's convoy got through. The English Siege of Orléans now had all the supplies it needed, including barrels and barrels of herring. The Battle of the Herrings broke French morale. The attempt to relieve Orléans had failed. The English siege was stronger than ever. Inside the city, people were starting to despair, starting to talk about negotiating surrender, about accepting English rule rather than starving. Even Dunois was worried. He knew he could hold out for a few more months, but not forever. France needed a miracle. And on that same day, February 12th, 1429, while the Battle of the Herrings was being fought, a miracle was being set in motion. Because 200 miles away, in the town of Vaucouleurs, a 17-year-old peasant girl named Joanne was meeting with Robert de Baudricourt, trying to convince him to give her an armed escort to see the Dauphin, trying to explain that she had divine visions, that God had chosen her to save France, that she needed to go to Orléans. Baudricourt thought she was crazy, had dismissed her twice before, but this time something made him listen. Maybe desperation, maybe something he saw in her conviction, maybe just the fact that France had literally nothing left to lose. He agreed, gave her an escort, 6 soldiers, sent her to Chinon to meet Charles. Joan arrived at Chinon in late February or early March. The court was skeptical, obviously. A peasant girl claiming divine visions, saying God had sent her to lead armies? It sounded like madness, or heresy, or both. But Charles met with her anyway. They had a private conversation. We don't know exactly what was said, but Joan apparently told Charles something that convinced him, something personal, something only he would know. Charles' confessor later testified that Joan reassured the Dauphin about his legitimacy, about whether he was truly the rightful heir. This was Charles's deepest insecurity. His mother had publicly questioned his paternity, had suggested he might be a bastard. Joan somehow addressed this, gave him confidence, made him believe. But Charles was still cautious. He had Joan examined by theologians, had her questioned for weeks, testing whether her visions were genuine or demonic, whether she was sent by God or by the devil. The examination concluded she was sincere, that her virginity and piety were real, that her mission seemed divinely inspired, or at least not obviously satanic. So Charles made a decision. He'd send Joan to Orléans, give her a suit of armour, a banner, a symbolic command position. He didn't put her in actual military command. That went to the Duke of Alençon and other experienced commanders. But Joan would go with the relief force, would boost morale, would give the soldiers something to believe in. In late April 1429, Joan joined a relief army assembling at Blois. About 5,000 troops, not a huge force, but enough. Enough to fight their way into Orléans through that northeastern gap. Enough to reinforce Dunois. Enough to change the equation. The army set out from Blois on April 27th. Joan rode with them, wearing armour, carrying her banner. The banner was white, had the words Jesus Maria embroidered on it, had images of God and angels. It became iconic, the symbol of Joan's mission, of French resistance, of divine intervention. The relief force reached Orléans on April 29th, late evening. They approached from the east, through that gap in the English siege lines. The English saw them coming, watched from the Bastille at Saint-Lô. But the French force was too strong, too well armed. The English commander at Saint-Laurent, where the main English camp was located, made a calculation. He could attack, try to intercept the relief force, but he'd be outnumbered and fighting at night, against troops who were fresh and motivated. The risk wasn't worth it. He let them through. Joan entered Orléans as part of a torchlight parade. Thousands of citizens lining the streets, cheering, crying, touching her armour, trying to get close to the girl who'd come to save them. The effect was electric. People who'd been close to despair suddenly had hope, had belief. This peasant girl, this virgin warrior sent by God, was here. The siege would be broken. Orléans would be saved. It sounds irrational, superstitious. But in medieval culture, in a deeply religious society, this kind of symbolism mattered more than modern people can easily understand. Dunois met with Joan. They had a complicated relationship from the start. Dunois was a professional soldier. He'd been fighting the English for years, had defended Orléans for months, and now this teenage girl, with no military training, was being treated as some kind of saviour. But Dunois was also smart. He recognised that Joan's real value wasn't tactical, it was psychological. She'd given his troops belief, given civilians hope. That was worth more than another 1,000 soldiers. So Dunois incorporated Joan into his plans, let her attend war councils, let her speak to the troops, let her be visible, be the symbol, while he handled the actual military decisions. Or so he thought, because Joan had ideas of her own, and she wasn't shy about expressing them. On May 1st, Dunois left the city, went to Blois to organise another supply convoy, left the garrison in the hands of La Hire, one of his best commanders, and left Joan in Orléans. During this time, Joan did something that showed either incredible courage or incredible foolishness, or both. She rode out of the city, alone, or with just a small escort, rode to within shouting distance of the English fortifications and surveyed them, wanted to see what she was up against. At one point, she exchanged words with William Glasdale, the English commander at Les Tourelles. Glasdale shouted insults, called her a whore, a coward. Other things. Joan shouted back, told him to surrender, to yield to the King of Heaven, Told him he'd called her names he'd regret. Glasdale laughed, told his men to capture her if she came closer, told them they'd burn her as a witch. Joan rode back into Orléans, but now she'd seen the English positions, understood the layout, knew what needed to be done. On May 3rd, Dunois's supply convoy left Blois, headed for Orléans. Other convoys were also moving, from Montargis, from Guyenne, all converging on the city, all risking English interception. The convoys arrived on May 4th, early morning, via the north bank, in full view of the English at Saint-Laurent. But again, the English didn't attack. The convoys were too strong, too well protected. The English let them pass, and at noon on May 4th, Dunois made a decision. He was going to attack, not wait for the English to make the next move, take the fight to them. His target was the Bastille at Saint-Lô, the isolated English fort to the east of the city. If he could take it, he'd widen that gap, make it easier for future supply convoys, show the English that French forces were on the offensive now. Dunois assembled 1,500 men, launched the assault. Joan almost missed it. She'd been resting, napping, when the attack started. But someone woke her, told her French forces were engaged. Joan grabbed her armor, her banner, rushed to join the fight. The English garrison at Saint-Lô numbered about 400. They were heavily outnumbered, but they had fortifications, walls, positions. They fought back hard, made the French pay for every yard. John Talbot, commanding English forces at Saint-Père on the north end of the city, saw what was happening, launched a diversionary attack, trying to pull French forces away from Saint-Lô, trying to relieve the pressure. But Dunois had anticipated this, had troops ready. They repelled Talbot's sortie, kept him pinned down, couldn't help the men at Saint-Lô. After several hours of fighting, Saint-Lô fell. The French overran it, killed about 140 English soldiers, took 40 prisoners. Some of the English defenders fled to a nearby church, tried to claim sanctuary. The French soldiers wanted to kill them anyway, but Joan intervened, insisted their lives be spared. The soldiers listened to her, let the English prisoners live. When Talbot heard that Saint-Lô had fallen, he withdrew his attack, retreated back to Saint-Père. The first Bastille had been captured, the first English fort had fallen, and Joan had been there, fighting, leading, inspiring, exactly as she'd said she would. The next day, May 5th, was Ascension Day, a holy day. Joan insisted there be no fighting, spent the day in prayer, but she also sent letters to the English, demanded they surrender, told them to leave France, to accept God's will. The English response was predictable. They insulted her, called her names, rejected any suggestion of surrender. May 6th. Dunois decided to attack again, this time targeting the English positions on the south bank, the Bastille at Saint-Jean-le-Blanc, the monastery at Les Augustins, and ultimately Les Tourelles itself, the bridge complex, the heart of the English siege. The plan was complex. French forces would cross the river using boats and barges, land on an island in the middle of the Loire, cross from there to the south bank via a makeshift pontoon bridge, then attack from the west, cut off Saint-Jean-le-Blanc, capture it before the English could reinforce. But William Glasdale was smart. He saw what the French were planning, saw where they were positioning forces, and he made his own decision. He abandoned Saint-Jean-le-Blanc, destroyed it, concentrated his troops at the central defensive complex, Les Augustins, the Boulevard, and Les Tourelles, created a stronger, more compact defensive position. Before the French had fully disembarked on the south bank, La Hire launched an attack on the Boulevard. The Boulevard was an outlying fortification to the south of Les Tourelles, defending the approach. La Hire's attack was probably too hasty, too aggressive, but that was La Hire's style. Hit hard. Hit fast. Don't wait. The assault was exposed to flanking fire from Les Augustins. English archers poured arrows into the French forces. The attack stalled, started to collapse. Then someone shouted that the English garrison from Saint-Privé was coming, rushing east to reinforce Glassdale, to cut off the French attack. Panic set in. The French forces retreated, ran back toward the landing zones, dragging Joan with them. The English in the boulevard saw this, saw the witch fleeing, saw French morale breaking. They charged out, chased the retreating French, trying to turn retreat into rout, into massacre. And then Joan did something remarkable. According to the accounts, she stopped running, turned around, alone, raised her banner, and shouted, "Au nom de Dieu!" in the name of God. The English, seeing this, hesitated, stopped their pursuit. Some accounts say they were frightened, that the image of Joan standing there, fearless, divine, was too much, that they believed God was protecting her. Others say they were just being tactical, worried about overextending, about being cut off themselves. Whatever the reason, they stopped, returned to the boulevard, and the French forces, seeing Joan's courage, rallied, turned around, regrouped. The commanders made a new decision. Forget the boulevard for now. Attack Les Augustins, the fortified monastery to the west. They launched the assault. This time it succeeded. After hours of brutal fighting, Les Augustins fell. The French captured it just before nightfall. Glassdale's garrison was now isolated, cut off from support, blockaded in the Tourelle complex. That same night, the English garrison at Saint-Privé evacuated, abandoned their fort, crossed north of the river to join their comrades at Saint-Laurent. The southern perimeter was collapsing. The English siege was coming apart. Joan had been wounded during the assault on Les Augustins, stepped on a metal spike, injured her foot. Nothing major, but enough that she was taken back to Orléans overnight to recover. That evening, the French commanders held a war council without Joan. They debated the next move. Some wanted to press the attack, strike at Les Tourelles immediately. Others wanted to consolidate, rest the troops, wait for reinforcements. The cautious faction won. The decision was made to wait, to attack Les Tourelles the next day, or maybe the day after. Joan wasn't consulted, wasn't told about the decision. The morning of May 7th, someone told Joan the plan, told her to sit out the assault, to stay in the city, rest, recover from her foot wound. Joan refused, absolutely refused. She roused herself, put on her armour, crossed to the south bank. The citizens of Orléans, inspired by Joan, raised more militia, thousands of them, showed up at the gates ready to fight. The professional commanders were distressed. They didn't want untrained civilians in a major assault. Too risky, too chaotic. But Joan prevailed upon them, convinced them to let the militia join. The citizens also started working on the bridge, the broken section that separated Orléans from the Tourelle. They laid beams across the gap, created a makeshift crossing. This would allow a two-sided attack. French forces from the south bank and from the city itself. The assault on Les Tourelles began early on May 7th. The French attacked from the south, from Les Augustins, trying to storm the fortifications. Glassdale's garrison was strong, 700 to 800 men, well positioned, with artillery, with crossbows, with every advantage defensive warfare provided. They fought back hard, repelled assault after assault. Joan was there, in the thick of it, not commanding. The professional commanders were handling tactics, but leading, inspiring, holding her banner, showing the soldiers that God was with them. Early in the assault, Joan was standing in the trench to the south of Les Tourelles, holding her banner, encouraging the troops, and an English longbow arrow struck her, hit between her neck and left shoulder, punched through her armour, buried itself in her flesh. She fell, blood pouring from the wound. Rumours spread immediately. Joan is dead. The witch is dead. The spell is broken. English morale surged. French morale faltered. But Joan wasn't dead. The arrow had missed major blood vessels, missed arteries, by inches, maybe by luck, maybe by divine protection. Her followers carried her to the rear, laid her down. She was crying, in pain, bleeding, seeing her own blood, feeling the reality of war in a way she hadn't before. Some soldiers wanted to use a charm to stop the bleeding. Folk magic. Joan refused, said she wouldn't be healed by unholy means. Instead, she had the wound dressed with a little oil. Then she pulled the arrow out herself, with her own hands. The pain must have been excruciating, but she did it. Then she asked for her confessor, spent time in prayer. While she was gone, the French assaults continued, and failed, again and again. The English held. Les Tourelles was too strong, the walls too high, the defenders too determined. By late afternoon, Dunois was ready to give up, ready to sound the retreat, to withdraw. Try. Again, another day. He'd taken heavy casualties. His men were exhausted. There was no shame in retreating now, consolidating, coming back stronger. But Joan sent for him, for all the commanders, begged them not to despair, told them God had shown her they would succeed, that they just needed to keep trying. One more assault, one final push. Dunois looked at this teenage girl, wounded, bleeding, exhausted, and somehow she had more conviction than any of his veteran soldiers. He agreed. One more assault. Joan returned to the fighting, blood seeping through the bandage on her shoulder, carrying her banner, and the sight of her, wounded but unbowed, ignited something in the French troops. They attacked again, with renewed fury, renewed determination. The citizens of Orléans, watching from the repaired section of bridge, joined the assault from the north, attacked Les Tourelles from both sides simultaneously. A Biscayan soldier was carrying Joan's banner. Joan had told the troops that when the banner touched the wall, they should enter. The soldier waved the banner forward, touched the wall with it. And whether this was divine signal or coincidence, or Joan's brilliant psychological manipulation, the French forces surged forward. Ladders went up, men climbed. The English defenders, exhausted from hours of fighting, couldn't repel them all. French soldiers reached the battlements, established footholds, started fighting hand-to-hand on the walls. From the city side, more French troops poured across the makeshift bridge connection, attacked the gatehouse. The English were now fighting on two fronts, north and south. They couldn't hold both. William Glasdale made a desperate decision. He'd try to escape, retreat across a wooden drawbridge that connected Les Tourelles to an island in the river. From there, maybe he could reach safety on the north bank. Glasdale and a few dozen of his men ran for the drawbridge, but French forces from the city had set fire to it. The flames were spreading, weakening the structure. Glasdale didn't know this, couldn't see it clearly in the chaos. He ran onto the bridge. It collapsed under the weight. Glasdale and his men plunged into the Loire, wearing full armour. The weight dragged them straight to the bottom. They drowned, every one of them. According to Joan's later testimony, she'd warned Glasdale this would happen, had shouted to him days before that he'd perish by water, that he'd called her names he'd regret, and now he was dead, drowned in the Loire. Whether Joan had genuine prophetic vision, or just made a lucky guess, or understood that a soldier defending a river crossing might die in that river, the troops believed she'd predicted it, believed God had spoken through her. Les Tourelles fell that evening, May 7th, 1429. The garrison was wiped out, hundreds dead, including Glasdale, scores captured. The French now controlled the south bank, controlled the bridge, The siege was breaking. That night, Joan returned to Orléans, wound, dressed properly now, exhausted, triumphant. The city erupted in celebration. Bells rang. People danced in the streets, prayed, thanked God, thanked Joan. The impossible had happened. The English stronghold had fallen. The next morning, May 8th, was Sunday. The English remaining forces assembled north of the city, in battle formation, ready to fight. This was Lord Talbot's decision. He'd gathered every English soldier still in the siege lines, probably 3,000 men, maybe 4,000. Formed them up, challenged the French to come out and fight a proper battle. This was standard medieval practice. After a siege action, both sides would often form up the next day, give each other the chance for decisive battle. The French came out, thousands of them, formed their own battle line. The two armies faced each other across a field outside the city walls. Joan was there, wearing her armor, carrying her banner, but she did something unexpected. She told her forces not to attack, said it was Sunday, a holy day. If the English attacked, the French would defend, would fight, but she wouldn't initiate battle on the Lord's Day. For an hour, the two armies stood there, staring at each other, waiting, testing. The English didn't attack, didn't charge. Talbot was smart enough to recognize that French morale was sky high, that his own troops were demoralized, that attacking now, against a larger force with divine favor, would be suicide. So he didn't. Instead, after that hour of standoff, Talbot made his decision. He ordered a retreat. The English forces broke formation, marched away, north toward Meung, toward the other English-held towns along the Loire. The Siege of Orléans was over. 9 days after Joan arrived, the English were gone. The bastilles were abandoned. The ring was broken. The city was free. The strategic consequences were immediate and enormous. Orléans didn't fall. France didn't collapse. The Dauphin, Charles, didn't flee. Instead, momentum swung to the French side, completely, irreversibly. Over the next 2 months, Joan participated in the Loire campaign. French forces retook Jargeau, retook Meung-sur-Loire, retook Beaugency, every town the English had captured on their way to Orléans. The English tried to regroup, tried to hold what they still controlled, but their confidence was shattered. Their belief in inevitable victory was gone, and the French belief in inevitable defeat had transformed into belief in divine intervention, in Joan, in victory. On June 18th, 1429, at the Battle of Patay, French forces caught the retreating English army, destroyed it, killed thousands, captured John Talbot and Thomas Scales, two of England's best commanders. The battle was over in hours. It was Agincourt in reverse. French cavalry smashing through English positions before the longbowmen could set up their stakes, before they could create defensive positions. It was a slaughter. English power in central France collapsed. The road to Reims was open, and in July 1429, Charles was crowned King Charles VII at Reims Cathedral, the traditional coronation site for French kings. Joan stood beside him, the peasant girl who'd made this possible, who'd turned the tide, who'd given France back its kingdom. But we need to go back, need to understand what actually happened at Orléans, because the legend obscures the reality. The popular version of the story says Joan showed up, performed miracles, and the English ran away. That's not true. The siege lasted 7 months. October 1428 to May 1429. Joan was there for 9 days, 9 critical days. But the English didn't leave because of miracles. They left because they'd lost their defensive positions, because their supply lines were threatened, because their casualties were unsustainable, because the strategic calculus had changed. Joan's contribution wasn't supernatural. It was psychological and tactical. Psychologically, she gave French forces something they desperately needed: belief. For months, the defenders of Orléans had been fighting a defensive war, holding out, waiting for relief, hoping not to starve. Joan changed that mindset, turned defense into offense, made soldiers believe they could win. Not just survive, but win. That psychological shift was enormous. Soldiers fought harder, took more risks, coordinated better. Civilians contributed more, raised militia, worked on fortifications, brought supplies. Everyone pulled in the same direction because they believed in Joan, believed God was on their side, believed France deserved to win. Tactically, Joan's presence allowed aggressive moves that might otherwise have been deemed too risky. The assault on Saint-Lô, the attack on Les Augustins, the final assault on Les Tourelles. Professional commanders like Dunois might have hesitated, might have waited for better conditions, better odds, more reinforcements. But Joan pushed for action, demanded it, and her presence meant that soldiers would follow even risky orders. Because if Joan said God wanted them to attack, they attacked. This created opportunities, caught the English off balance, forced them to respond rather than dictate terms. The English siege depended on maintaining their ring of fortifications, each bastille supporting the others, creating interlocking zones of control. When Saint-Lô fell, a gap opened. When the south bank positions collapsed, the entire southern perimeter was gone. When Les Tourelles fell, the bridge was lost. And without the bridge, without control of the river crossing, the siege was finished. The English couldn't prevent supplies from reaching Orléans, couldn't threaten the city effectively, couldn't justify the casualties they'd take trying to maintain what was left. Talbot's decision to retreat on May 8th was military pragmatism, not divine intervention. He looked at his positions, looked at his losses, looked at French momentum and morale, and calculated that staying would mean destruction, that withdrawing would preserve his army, let them regroup, fight another day. It was the right military decision, but it was also an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that the Siege of Orléans had failed, that France wasn't beaten, that the war would continue, and that changed everything. The 100 Years' War, which had seemed to be ending with English victory, now had decades left to run. The momentum had shifted, and it never shifted back. Let's talk about the cost, the casualties, because siege warfare in the medieval period was brutal, bloody, wasteful. We don't have precise casualty figures. Record keeping in 1429 wasn't systematic, but we can estimate. The English probably lost around 1,200 to 1,500 men killed during the entire siege. Several hundred at Saint-Lô, several hundred more at Les Augustins and Les Tourelles, smaller numbers in daily skirmishes and sorties, plus desertion. Soldiers who just left, walked away, went home. The siege lasted months. It was winter, then spring, cold, wet. Disease was rampant. Dysentery, typhus, infections from minor wounds. Many English soldiers died from disease rather than combat. The French defenders probably lost 800 to 1,000 killed. Again, combination of combat casualties and disease. The civilian population suffered too, not as much as they would have if the siege had turned into full starvation. But there was hunger, rationing, suffering. Some civilians died from malnutrition-related diseases, from the stress and deprivation of living under siege. The wounded on both sides numbered in the thousands. Medieval medicine was crude. Battlefield surgery consisted of amputating shattered limbs, cauterizing wounds with hot oil or red-hot irons, praying the patient didn't die from shock or infection. Many wounded died days or weeks after their injuries, from infection, from gangrene, from blood loss they couldn't recover from. Joan herself was lucky. That arrow that struck her could easily have killed her, could have severed an artery, could have punctured a lung. Instead, it left a wound that healed. That didn't get infected. That left her able to continue fighting. Whether that was luck or divine protection, the result was the same. She survived, continued her mission, became the symbol that changed French history. The siege also had economic costs, massive ones. Maintaining an army of 4,000 men for 7 months required enormous resources. Food, weapons, ammunition, wages for soldiers. The English were financing this from their holdings in northern France, from taxes on occupied territories, from their treasury in London. When the siege failed, those resources were wasted, spent for nothing. The French side had costs too. Maintaining the garrison, feeding the civilian population, paying for the relief armies that fought their way into the city. But those costs were justified by victory, by survival, by keeping Orléans in French hands. The economic burden was worth it because the alternative was losing the city, losing the war, losing France. Now let's discuss the English perspective, because from their side, the Siege of Orléans was a strategic disaster born from overconfidence. Salisbury's original plan made sense on paper. Orléans was isolated, poorly supplied. Its fall seemed inevitable if properly besieged. And the English had won so many sieges before, had perfected the art of siege warfare through decades of practice. The problem was numbers. 4,000 men weren't enough to completely invest a city the size of Orléans. The gaps in the siege lines, particularly to the northeast, meant the blockade was never complete. Supplies kept trickling in, just enough to prevent starvation, just enough to keep resistance alive. If Salisbury had lived, he might have recognized this problem, might have called for more troops, might have adjusted the strategy. But Salisbury died 9 days into the siege, and his replacement, Suffolk, didn't believe in the operation, didn't push for the resources that might have made it succeed. The English also underestimated French morale. They thought Orléans would surrender once the citizens realized the situation was hopeless, once hunger set in, once they understood that relief wasn't coming. But the citizens of Orléans were determined. They'd rather die than submit to English rule. This wasn't just patriotism. This was survival. Everyone knew what happened to cities that surrendered after long sieges. Sacking, looting, rape, murder. Surrendering to the English after months of resistance didn't guarantee safety. It guaranteed revenge, so the citizens fought, supported the garrison, endured the hardship, waited for relief. And when Joan arrived, when that relief finally came, their determination paid off. The English tactical decisions during the siege were also questionable. Abandoning Saint-Jean-le-Blanc before the French even attacked might have been prudent. Concentrated forces at the critical points. But it also surrendered territory, gave the French a staging area for their assault on Les Augustins. The decision to defend Les Tourelles to the last man, to not evacuate when the position became untenable, cost England hundreds of experienced soldiers, including Glassdale. Competent commanders were harder to replace than regular troops. Every knight, every man-at-arms, every experienced archer who died at Orléans was a loss England couldn't easily afford. And those losses came at the worst possible time, just as English power in France was reaching its maximum extent, just when consolidation should have been the priority. The psychological impact of Orléans on English forces cannot be overstated. They'd won at Agincourt. They'd conquered Normandy. They'd captured Paris. They'd defeated every major French army sent against them. They believed they were destined to win, that God favoured the English cause, that French resistance was just delaying the inevitable. Orléans shattered that belief, showed that the English could be beaten, that their vaunted siege tactics could fail, that God, if he was intervening at all, might be on the French side. The Battle of the Herrings should have been the confirmation, should have proven that English tactics still worked, that French resistance was futile. Instead, it was followed by the loss of Orléans, by French resurgence, by disaster at Patay. The English never recovered their confidence, never regained the psychological dominance they'd held for 15 years. And without that confidence, without that sense of inevitable victory, their grip on France weakened, town by town, battle by battle. Over the next 24 years, from 1429 to 1453, England would lose everything they'd gained in France, except Calais. The 100 Years' War would end with French victory, with England expelled from the continent, with the great English adventure in France reduced to historical footnote. And it all started at Orléans. All started with the siege that failed, with the girl who shouldn't have mattered but did. So what was the Siege of Orléans really about? Strip away the legend. Strip away the divine intervention narrative. Strip away Joan's mythological status. What's left? A siege that lasted 7 months, that involved thousands of soldiers on both sides, that was fought with swords and arrows and cannons and determination. That was decided by tactical mistakes, strategic miscalculations, and the human factors of morale and belief. The English tried to starve Orléans into submission, failed because they didn't have enough troops to complete the encirclement, failed because they lost their best commander early, failed because they underestimated French resolve. The French held out, fought back, launched sorties that disrupted English construction and harassed their positions, waited for relief that came just in time. When Joan arrived, she didn't bring miracles. She brought belief, brought aggression, brought the psychological weapon that transformed defense into offense. The 9 days of Joan's participation in the siege were decisive, not because of supernatural intervention, but because they concentrated French effort, coordinated disparate forces, created a unified command structure that prioritized action over caution. Professional commanders like Dunois and La Hire might have eventually broken the siege anyway, might have achieved the same results through careful planning and traditional tactics, but Joan compressed the timeline, made it happen immediately, prevented the siege from dragging on for months more, prevented the starvation and disease that would have killed thousands more civilians. Her presence mattered. Her courage mattered. Her conviction mattered. Whether that came from God or from her own unshakable belief is ultimately irrelevant to the military outcome. Orléans was the hinge, the moment when English conquest stopped, when French resistance became French resurgence, when the narrative changed from "when will France surrender" to "when will England leave?" Everything that followed, from the coronation at Reims to the eventual French victory in 1453, traces back to May 1429, to those 9 days, to the decisions made on the walls and in the trenches and on the bridge, to the soldiers who fought and died for yards of stone and dirt, to the commanders who gambled everything on one more assault, to the girl who believed God had sent her to save France and convinced everyone else to believe it too. The legacy of Orléans extends far beyond the 100 Years' War. Joan of Arc became one of the most famous women in history, martyred a year after Orléans when the English captured her and burned her at the stake for heresy. But her martyrdom only strengthened the legend, made her immortal, made her the symbol of French resistance, of nationalism, of faith overcoming impossible odds. 500 years after her death, she was canonized as a saint. The peasant girl who'd claimed to hear voices became Saint Joan, patron saint of France, of soldiers, of prisoners. Her story has been told and retold, adapted into plays, movies, books, operas, embellished with each retelling. The historical Joan, the real girl who lived and fought and died, has been buried under layers of myth, but the core truth remains. She went to Orléans, she fought, she won, and she changed history. The Siege of Orléans itself is studied in military academies, analysed for its tactical lessons. The importance of complete encirclement in siege warfare, the danger of divided command, the psychological factors that determine outcomes as much as material factors, the role of civilian morale in determining whether a city holds or surrenders. Modern military historians look at Orléans and see case study in how sieges can fail, how defenders can win if they hold out long enough, how relief forces can break sieges if they act decisively. The specific tactics, the use of bastilles, the river crossing operations, the coordination between forces inside and outside the city, all of it provides lessons that remain relevant. But perhaps the most important lesson from Orléans is about belief, about what people can accomplish when they believe their cause is just, when they believe victory is possible, when they believe God or fate or history is on their side. The defenders of Orléans believed they could hold out. The citizens believed their suffering had purpose. The relief army believed they could break through, and Joan believed she was destined to save France. Those beliefs, irrational as they might seem, created reality, created the conditions for victory, made the impossible possible. That's the true miracle of Orléans. Not supernatural intervention, but human determination, human courage, human refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed certain. From October 1428 to May 1429, Orléans was the centre of the world, the place where the fate of France was being decided, where medieval warfare was being waged at its most brutal and most sophisticated, where thousands of lives hung in the balance, where history was being written in real time. The siege began with confidence, English confidence that Orléans would fall, that France would be conquered, that Henry VI would rule both England and France as a unified kingdom. It ended with French triumph, with English retreat, with the recognition that France wasn't beaten, wasn't ready to surrender, wasn't going to accept foreign domination. The men who fought there, English and French, were professionals, soldiers who'd spent years at war, who knew the business of killing and dying, who understood tactics and strategy and the realities of medieval combat. They weren't fighting for abstract principles. They were fighting for pay, for loyalty to their lords, for survival. But they fought bravely, fought hard, died by the hundreds in ditches and on walls and in burning buildings. Their names are mostly lost. The common soldiers who made up the bulk of both armies are anonymous. But their sacrifice, their suffering, their courage under impossible conditions, that's what made Orléans possible, made the victory possible, made the legend possible. Joan gets the credit, deservedly. But she stood on the shoulders of thousands of unknown soldiers who'd been fighting and dying for months before she arrived, who'd held the walls, who'd launched the sorties, who'd defended every inch of ground. Dunois and his commanders deserve credit too, for their strategic planning, for their tactical competence, for their willingness to incorporate this strange peasant girl into their operations, for their ability to use her as the psychological weapon she was while maintaining professional military standards. The citizens of Orléans deserve credit for their endurance, for their refusal to surrender, for their contribution of militia and supplies and labour, for believing that holding out was worth the suffering. All of these factors combined to create the outcome, to break the siege, to save France. The English soldiers who fought at Orléans deserve mention too. They weren't villains, weren't evil. They were men following orders, trying to complete their mission, suffering through winter in inadequate shelters, dying from disease and French arrows, serving what they believed was a rightful claim to the French throne. When they retreated on May 8th, they weren't running from divine wrath. They were acknowledging military reality, making the hard decision to withdraw rather than die pointlessly. Talbot and the other English commanders did the best they could with the resources and situation they had. They lost, but they lost to a better positioned, better motivated enemy, not to supernatural forces. If this complete history of the Siege of Orléans has shown you how complex and brutal medieval warfare actually was, then make sure you're subscribed, because I'm uncovering the full stories behind history's most famous battles. The real accounts that textbooks simplify and movies dramatize. These soldiers, French and English, deserve to have their true story told. Not the sanitized legend, not the simplified version, but the complete picture of what happened from October 1428 to May 1429. Drop a comment telling me which part of the siege shocked you the most. Salisbury's death? The Battle of the Herrings? Joan's arrow wound? The fall of Les Tourelles? Because understanding what actually happened, understanding the real 7 months of siege warfare that Joan compressed into 9 days of decision, that's how we honor everyone who fought there. That's how we understand why Orléans mattered, why it changed history, why 700 years later, we still remember the siege that saved France. And I'll see you in the next one.